My name is Mick Jones. I'm the Group Head of Logistics for DS Smith, and I'll explain who DS Smith are. I have this habit of working for companies that nobody's ever heard of, but I'll explain who DS Smith is in a minute. Prior to this, I worked for Lenovo, another company nobody had ever heard of. And prior to that, I was in senior roles in DHL, Danzas, Deutsche Post, and, if you remember them, SCL Logistics. Ooh. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to do three things. Tell you a little bit, do the advert bit and tell you a little bit about DS Smith quickly, and about the sort of network, the logistics network that we have in DS Smith. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our approach to strategy and show you a couple of videos. We have it's not unique, but a very different approach to developing the strategy in the business, and that therefore has a different impact on the way that we develop the logistics, the back-end network for the business. So, excuse me. I'll show you a couple of videos that are based on the strategy scenarios we've pulled together, and then I'll talk a little bit about this thing that we've called Logistics 2020, which is effectively the transformation process we're trying to go through in the logistics network to support the growth of the business. All right, so I don't know how many of you are involved in massive change programs, but that's often what it feels like. Certainly it's felt like that the last 3 or 4 that I've been through. You know, can you find us a bold and innovative way to do everything exactly the same way as we've done it in the last 25 years? And it happens, this is what happens a lot in businesses. So, let me set the scene. So, this is DS Smith. We call ourselves a supply cycle organization. What DS Smith do is they manage recycling, the manufacturing of paper, the manufacturing of cardboard, from that the manufacturing of boxes that go into retailers, that go into consumers, that then get collected and they go around the loop again. So it's a supply cycle. 26,000 employees, 265 operations, 270 something now in 36 countries across the world. Founded in 1940, a UK, an English company. Listed on the FTSE, no, about to be listed on the FTSE Stock Exchange, probably within the next 6 months. We're getting bigger. The second largest manufacturer of corrugated products in Europe. So 3 million tons of paper, 5.3 million tons of fiber recycled, 3.6 million tons of corrugated packaging, and I think that makes 10 billion boxes every year. So, some figures. That's what we do: packaging, recycling, paper, and plastics. And those are the sorts of products we make. Doesn't come up that well, but everything from beer crates, plastic beer crates, through to the reels of paper. These things are 2.7 meters tall. They weigh about 2.8 to 3 tons each. Paper and card, boxes, the whole gamut, all the way through to point of display, interactive packaging, that sort of process. So that's what we make. And you know, it's interesting. I joined the company probably 8 months ago now. Feels like 8 years. I joined the company about 8 years ago, and I just thought it was a packaging company with a lot of problems. But actually, packaging is a really, really interesting area. And it sounds, you know, you end up being a spod. Because packaging, you think about it, the economies can do that, but everything needs a package. Everything needs to be surrounded in something. So packaging is becoming more and more about its and we'll show you some of this in some of the strategy work we've done, more and more about its interaction with the customer. Packaging is becoming intelligent. Packaging is how you reduce the amount of air in a parcel that you send. So packaging is a really, really cool part of it, and everybody has to use it effectively. A couple of things about packaging. So a recycled box, the first time a box is made, called virgin fiber. No, it's not called virgin fiber. The first box that's made from virgin fiber is the tree, goes round the cycle 6 to 10 times. So it can do 6 to 10 times around that whole cycle. And each time it goes round, the reason you can only do it 6 to 10 times is if you look at a fiber, it's like a little tree. It's like a little sort of tree with branches. And every time you process it, you break the tree in half. So if you start off with 16 fibre branches on this fibre, by the time you get the second time round, it's only got 8. The third time round, it's got 4. The fifth time round, it's got 2. When you've only got 1 branch, it won't interlock. So it's simple chemistry. The paper plants that make these things are massive. The machines themselves are probably 400 metres long. You can have 4 or 5 machines, 7 metres wide, 4 or 5 machines in a paper factory. And they're like they're like villages. I think the biggest one in Europe is we run one in Kemsley in Kent. And most of them have been there for many, many, many years because they have to be on land that's cheap. They have to be close to water because they use an immense amount of water. And you can't really stop these things. It's a bit like glass. You stop a glass works and suddenly you've got solid glass. You stop a paper plant and suddenly you've got solid paper all the way through your machine. It takes you about 4 to 6 weeks to go and clean the machine out and reset the whole machine. So these things are about constantly running, creating paper. So that's the business, effectively. Packaging everywhere. Packaging's local. You don't move packaging a long way. It doesn't weigh very much. It costs too much. Plastics, similar sort of thing, very local but very specialized. Paper moves across by road from country to country. And then recycling is, you collect recycling where you collect recycling. Interesting thing about recycling, the Chinese don't have any recycling process. They have very little recycling process in their country. So the Chinese at the moment are wandering around Europe trying to pick up any recycling that there is. They'll pay for any recycling. So we are moving recycled loads from the back of Tesco's DC straight to the port, straight to China. And we think we'll move 40,000 Fs in the next 18 months to China, India, and Indonesia. So that's the sort of cycle. It goes from, whichever end you want to start from. Paper into board plant into box plant into warehouse into customer, customer into consumer, consumer dumps it, back to recycling, back into the paper mill. It just does that on a constant basis. The reason you don't make every single box from a tree is every time you cut down a tree, you have to plant 10. And the economics behind that are ridiculous, unless you're in Sweden and you've got a lot of trees, which we don't have. So the one thing the Chinese are doing is planting lots of trees at the moment, so they can be self-sufficient in this. Fibre is our, if you like, it's our iron ore. Fibre is what drives our process. So we have to have fibre in as high a quality state as we possibly can at this end of the network. So it's even interesting for us to look at whether we become a final mile delivery organization, because the fibre that you get around in an Amazon box is good fibre. And if we can intercept that box and bring it into our process, we get another couple of travels around that process, which saves us a lot of money. As soon as you dump your box into the bin that says cardboard, it's polluted and you've probably lost two circuits of that process. So it's all about economics for us. And then sort of, we spend about 500 million euros on logistics, on warehouses, inventory, and transport. 400 of that on road, 350 of that on road transport, which means we move something like, I don't know, 500,000, 600,000 full truck equivalents a year in Europe. And 40,000 Fs it is, not Ts. 200 external warehouse locations. I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so that's us. Tell you a little bit about this sort of our view of strategy. So the packaging industry, strange as it sounds, is constantly changing. The pressure on the packaging industry in both ends, from the lack of fibre at that end and the new tech that's coming into that end, the need to make a box do more. Okay, so stores are getting less and less important in the process. So now the box that sits around the product, it becomes more important. So you've seen boxes with chips in, boxes with augmented reality, boxes with Q codes, all of that sort of stuff. And at this end, with the e-tailers, demanding, so we've just built a 400,000 square foot warehouse in Milton built. We've taken on a 400,000 square foot warehouse in Milton Keynes for Amazon because we have to hit Amazon in less than 4 hours from order to delivery. So we're sort of pressured from both ends. It's making this network bigger and more complicated and more expensive. So what we decided to do was to sort of create a series of scenarios when we did our strategy planning. And we did this thing, we called it putting it in a wind tunnel. So what that did was it allowed us to test our scenarios and create some sort of future scenarios for ourselves that would say sort of, okay, what would happen if this happened? What would happen if that happened? And I'll show you one of the videos in a minute. And it allowed us to say, what if now, rather than say, if only, when we got to that point in the future. We tested a whole load of drivers. So we looked at retail e-tail, the impact of retail e-tail. We looked at brands, what would happen if micro-brands became the norm everywhere. We looked at the sort of social pressures on packaging. What if packaging became the new tobacco? What if people sort of said, boo, packaging bad? We looked at what alternatives to forests, to fibre is there? Is there any other alternative? Can you use any other method of creating the cellulose? What happens when our customer base evolves? What if they start to manufacture locally, micro-manufacture locally? What about demographics, an older population, a middle-class population in cities? What happens to our product when that happens? What about legislation? What about when governments finally say that's enough is enough? Sorry to use that phrase. That's it, okay? No more packaging, or you have to take all of your packaging back. And then what about the technology that starts to get built into packaging as you develop it? So we sort of tested those drivers in a sort of future-based scenario look at our strategy. And I'll show you the first one of these, which talks about what happens if everything becomes an experience. So retail becomes not retail, but becomes this sort of almost showbiz experience. Oh, there we go.
In July 2021, the last mega supermarket in Europe closed. Once they were a feature of the outskirts of every town. Now they're gone, and people are asking, when did shopping stop being boring and become pure entertainment? Not so long ago, supermarkets were filled with brands we'd been familiar with for generations. Logos were a symbol of trust and consistency. The most successful brands spread across the world. From Brasilia to Bavaria, you could buy the same deodorant and the logo guaranteed that it would work. Global brands were big, reliable, and maybe a little unexciting. Then came the microbrands. Advanced manufacturing meant that you didn't need economies of scale. The internet meant a startup didn't need distribution or TV advertising budgets. Suddenly, small was not just beautiful, small was profitable. By 2019, microbreweries were selling more beer than all the big players put together. By 2020, the same had happened to cheese, chocolate, and even shampoo. Consumers' love of authenticity meant that sources had to be verifiable. Packaging became smart and traceable. The whole supply chain was available for anybody who wished to check. Globalization was out, local was in. Meanwhile, we were buying less and sharing more. Why own champagne glasses or a power hose when you only use them a few times a year? Now, you could borrow one instead. Big brands started to turn their products into services. Bosch now rents more power tools than it sells. If you need a hole in your wall, you can just order a drill. For a small price, it will come with a DIY expert. The packaging became an important part of the service, ensuring everything arrived and returned in perfect condition, day after day. The big manufacturers got personal. They customized products on a colossal scale. Levi's stores stopped selling clothing. Instead, they became places where customers were measured. Levi's aims to be custom tailoring every pair of jeans sold in the US by 2025. Those services extended deep into our lifestyles. In 2019, Gillette razors became available only by subscription. Its parent company, Procter & Gamble, opened 300 grooming academies across the US to teach men how to look their best. As television advertising stopped working, ad agencies evolved. By 2020, Unilever spent more on marketing in stores than it did on television. Supermarkets became theatres for brands. In the past, packaging told us about the features of a product, and television made it glamorous. Now, packaging has to do the whole job. It's part of the theatre, part of the storytelling of brands. The materials became part of that story, where they were sourced, how they were recycled. And shopping got more social. As shops became more entertaining, consumers flocked there, not to buy, but to enjoy all those experiences together. Retailers responded. Today, creches, games, live entertainment and cafes tempt us in. Shops have become the new nightclubs. As stores replenished themselves, staff went from shelf stacking to slick selling. Today, if you work in retail, you work in show business. As the last big box supermarket becomes a park, it's a good time to pause and reflect. Our weekly grocery shop used to be an experience we didn't want to think about. Now it's the experience we can't stop talking about.
Okay, so that's one of, we've developed 3 of these. We probably will develop more, but it's a very interesting way of looking at your strategy. Paint a scenario and see how that scenario then impacts your business and the elements of your business. So we're a business, you can see from that, that's really trying to adapt and evolve to the things that are going on around it. So the front end of our business is very, very adaptive. It's very it sort of moves in various different directions. It has to. The issue we have, as in most businesses, when the front end moves at that pace, the back end doesn't keep up. So really what that's driven us to do in supply chain and logistics is then look at the implications of the changes in that front end on the back end, what we need to do in the back end of the business. So really that gave us a number of questions that we started to ask, and these are some of them. So how do we create a network that can manage the move to e-com? How do we create our network that works with other networks to deliver e-com? So new customers, new demands on us to deliver to e-com providers, new demands on us to sort of create boxes that are optimum sizes, but in an environment where you can't tell what you can't have modularity. It's gone beyond modularity now. We're developing machines now that can select, that can create a box exactly the size of the product that sits inside the box. So no more of this opening up your Amazon and finding that pen drive in there and about 4 million tons of packaging around it. Now there's the technology to create the box the right size, to a degree. So this change in what we make towards intelligent packaging and in-store displays. Our business is very rapid. The growth area of our business is intelligent packaging and in-store, because suddenly in-store has become the sort of instant gratification part of the business. In-store has a very, very, very different supply chain requirement. Small amounts, quickly made, very high quality, delivered to a single location on a specific day. Whereas packaging, large amounts, loads of pallets delivered to a warehouse where they make stuff within a couple of days. So our business is sort of changing at that end and changing at that end. This mismatch we have between paper and pull. We talked about paper. You cannot switch a paper machine off. So effectively, a paper machine has to optimize to the width of the paper machine. Those of you that do sewing or drawing or whatever you do, tech drawing, you understand this complexity of trying to get as much as you can into the width of your paper, so that when you produce something, you create as little waste as you possibly can. So that's what a paper plant has to do. It has to optimize its output. So it's almost pushing. You know, fabulous, we know you need this stuff, but we have to make this or it becomes a ridiculously expensive process. At the other end, you've got packaging plants who are becoming more and more and more pull-driven, retail-driven. So you've got this absolute pull mechanism. Amazon, we want it in 4 hours, and we want these specific 5 boxes. At this end, you've got a paper process saying, no, 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 we've got to fill the width of the deckling, or we'll create loads of waste, and we'll waste money. So you've got that mismatch. Multiple ERPs. We're a business that's grown very, very quickly. We have doubled in size in 4 to 6 years, and we'll double in size again in the next 4 to 6 years. What that means is that at that speed, you take on board multiple ERPs. And that means that the most important thing that we all need, which is data, becomes incredibly complicated to get. It becomes very, very difficult to get because you're trying to get it from multiple ERPs. That also drives operational differences, because if you buy small organizations quickly, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to integrate them as well as much as you possibly could do. So we end up in our business with 270 sites and probably 200 different versions of a transport fleet. Each site with its own carriers and its own transport and its own method of operation. And this whole thing that it is packaging, it doesn't cost very much, so you can't have a very expensive supply chain. It has to be low cost. So all of those things were questions we had to ask ourselves. So we set ourselves a number of objectives. We wanted to reduce 1% of cost of logistics to sales over 34 months, 33 months now, over 3 years. The accountants got involved, so therefore that wasn't a case of transforming over 3 years. They said, yeah, but we want 50% of that in the first year. So that suddenly changed our process. We wanted to be operationally excellent, and that meant the same operations across different operational bases, and at the moment it's multiple. We had to deliver the value by working across those different divisions: paper, recycling, packaging, plastics, because they didn't talk to each other, and across the sites within each division. So that's where the value was. We had to be data and analytics driven. In a business that's got multiple people to convince and multiple speed of change, you have to have data and fact as your baseline. It's the only way you can convince a business to change. We had to start to focus on this customer experience. I called it Amazon-like, but we had to start to focus logistics a little bit on having a degree of customer experience. In a lot of organizations, certainly a lot of organizations I've worked in, that you're shielded from the outside world. We had to focus on end-to-end customer serviceability. As is typical in most organizations, logistics was the bum. Okay? It was, those guys, they never deliver on time. They always miss the OTIF. The reality is, if you give a package to a vehicle, it normally delivers it 99% of the time. The issue is not in logistics. It's in manufacturing, or it's in taking the order, or it's in quality. It's somewhere else. It's not in logistics. So we had to sort of create these measures that did order, cost, and lead time end to end, to stop walking around with a big target on our back so people would just shoot at us. And then we had to create this sort of future-proof network infrastructure, the ability to be agile because of all the change, and the ability to be integratable, if that's a word, because we're going to acquire more businesses. So, you can't really see that, but we define, and you'll see, I'll give you the slides, we define what good looked like, basically. Stuff like, you know, end-to-end processes, which not many of us have, data-driven, collaboration. So, that was where we wanted to get to. So we started to create this sort of initiative, this transformation initiative, which we based on 10 things. We had a baseline we had to create. You know, how do we set a baseline with no data, little data, or lots of data, but not necessarily the right data? How do you create a baseline to tell you where you start from and to continuously improve? So we had to do that. We then had to create 3 enablers. Real customer focus. We had to integrate ourselves with the rest of the business and be customer driven. People and structure that was about driving forward, was about innovation. Processes and systems that enabled us to be as productive as we possibly could. And then 5 initiatives. Centralize our supplier management. We manage suppliers across 273 sites, 275 sites. Optimize the transport. Okay, you've got all this transport moving around in DS Smith that doesn't actually necessarily optimize itself, so we've got to do that. Integrate into one network of stock locations. Almost every site has its own warehouse, its own series of warehouses, and each supplier, each salesman, when he goes out and meets a new customer, his natural inclination is to say, yeah, don't worry about it. We'll stick some stock over there in that warehouse. That's all right, no problem. We don't cost that into our product. So we have to get hold of that sort of network of stock. The big value for us is in end-to-end synergization. We're an organization that's a complete loop. And the reality is, in a complete loop, if you've got a process that works, we should be 10% better than everybody else in the marketplace. Because every action should have a reaction in our business as it goes around the loop. And it's our business. And then really this concept of making stuff future-proof. So we set ourselves a series of enablers and initiatives. And we worked out where the value is, or we have worked out where the value is. It's in 7 different areas, from in-house fleets, infrastructure optimization, collaboration, end-to-end management, central transport planning, supply management, and that big chunk called others, which is where you say, we're missing 10 million. It's got to be in others somewhere. And what I'll do is I'll take you through 7 of the things we did, or we're doing, sorry, not did. It'd be nice if we'd done them and I could just retire and do whatever I do. 7 things that we're doing. Firstly, data. You know, we talk a lot about data in logistics and supply chain. To me, data is the basis of all value. Okay? You have to have data to deliver value. You can't prove anything to anybody. You can't show anybody anything. You can't create a what if you haven't got data. So it's how you create capability. And a really interesting survey a couple of years ago in America where they asked a group of American companies how many of them felt they had the ability to what if. And only 11% of them said they felt they had the ability to evaluate a what if in their business. If you think about those 2 words, what if, they're the most important 2 words in any business. What if this happened? What if we did that? So you have to have the ability to look at what if. Our rapid growth meant multiple data sources. We've talked about that. We've got a culture, because we're so many different cultures, that has this, it demands evidence. It demands evidence to allow it to change. You have to show me that this works before I will change. Because like most organizations, we sort of tend to stand on the back foot a little bit. We had a corporate solution to integrate these ERPs, but as usual with those corporate solutions, they're years out. Okay? Try and get one SAP instance in your business, you'll be waiting for 5 to 10 years. And by the time you get there, something's changed and you've got to start changing again. So we had to have a short-term solution in logistics and transport to get this data. So we did 3 things. We bought into a system that's out there actually amazingly called Transporium, and we use that as our data layer effectively. That becomes our data layer. So we're very rapidly rolling Transporium out across all of our transport operations. Underneath the ERP, or above the, whichever you say, But underneath the sort of big process we're doing, just to get our data, because once we've got our data, we can start to deliver our value. We're starting to invest in a new data center of excellence in logistics. So I spend a load of money in Western Europe on analysts and on analytics. I've just decided to take all that money and put it down in Slovakia or Athens or somewhere like that and create a data center which is 3 times the size and probably 5 times cleverer. Okay? So investing in a data center. And then creating some sort of strategic analytical capability. The one thing we need to be able to do is, I haven't talked about it yet, but we have to create these digital baselines. If we want to be able to have a business that's sort of Lego brickish, we can adapt. We've got to create a digital baseline of each of the regions that we're sitting in and each of the areas we're sitting in so we can adapt that. The second thing we did was to look at visibility and TMS. All businesses need visibility. We all know that. We sort of get told that every single day. We needed to become more customer-centric, and visibility gave us that opportunity to become more customer-centric. It allowed us to give the business, your load has left, your load has arrived, and become part of that customer interaction. And it wasn't just status, it was cost visibility as well. We want to move towards a sort of a TCO type view of the world, a sort of cost to serve type view of the world, so we can prove things rather than be at the other end of the proof. Granularity of data and all the visibility is becoming increasingly granular because of its proximity. The customers now get involved in all of our supply chains. So we have to be able to give them that sort of granular view. And it has to be end to end. So we've sort of put together systems, again, Transform and other systems that allow us to look at that data, to manage that data, and to provide that data. At the other end, we needed to start to create sort of TMSs. And I guess we've got half a TMS in reality. We haven't quite got the bit that optimizes, but we've got the bit that manages the rates and the data and the information. So direct links into the ERP, the ability with Transform again to manage this link between a movement and a carrier. Okay? 2 things we're trying to do in optimization. I won't be able to do all of this. So 2 things we're trying to do in optimization. There's 2 types of movement in our business. One is full truck movements, exports, about 120, 130 million of full truck movements in Europe. So we're using Transporium to create this sort of full truck movements export control tower, which is relatively, and I say relatively easy. A full truck movement comes out as a del rec from the ERP, the multiple ERPs. That's our issue, connecting the ERPs. It goes into Transporium. Transporium associates it with a rate we've already negotiated. It gets associated with the haulier. The haulier goes off. We track and trace. We do electronic POD, and then we self-bill. So a relatively simple process. The difficulty is doing it. The difficulty is the time to do it. The rest of our business is nothing like that. The rest of our business is deliveries into retailers. It's deliveries into FMCG, so it's loading meters. It's a del rec, which is 4 loading meters, and then 2 loading meters and 5 loading meters. On top of that, in a lot of our operations, we have the typical process you will all have, which is no cut-off on manufacturing orders. So a salesman can come in last thing at night and say, oh, you've got to do this, it's really important. I need this order. So they change the whole manufacturing output and they put his order in and it goes through. So you're planning the day before at 5 o'clock, you're telling all your hauliers what they're doing, and the next morning they come in and you say, you're not going to Munich anymore, you're actually going to Paris. So the difficulty of that process. So we've got to try and create this sort of multiple domestic optimizing control tower. And because of our culture, we're having to go through a process that sort of says, okay, what we'll do is we'll create, you couldn't do one control tower in DS Smith for one country. There's so many different businesses in that country. So we're having to cluster businesses together. And we're having to sort of work with clusters of sites to sort of say, okay, well, before we do any optimization, talk about your routes. And that's already dropping value out because the guy in one site saying, actually, I deliver into Northern Ireland. The other guy's saying, I collect from Northern Ireland. Could we do that on the same truck? So we're sort of creating these rules and fixed routes in these sort of discussion groups in clusters. What we're then going to start to do, we're just about to do that now, is to introduce some sort of cluster-based planning. So say, guys, you're all talking to each other on a regular basis. Why don't we plan all your routes as a single cluster? And we'll give you some tech to do that. We'll give you some load planning tech or some route planning tech to allow you to do that. And if it then goes beyond that, we can then move into sort of regional planning and then link the two together. Okay? So we end up with a control tower managing full trucks, a series of control towers managing domestic, and the two linked together on the same platform. I won't talk a lot about supply management. We've talked about 2,000 suppliers we have, 400 million we spend, so our average share of wallet is 200,000 with a supplier. On a 200,000 share of wallet, a supplier makes a net margin of 10,000 euros. Try and get them to innovate on a net margin of 10,000 euros, impossible. So we've got to do a lot of work in this managing the suppliers. Our issue is culturally, we can't own it all. So we're having to create a centre of excellence in the centre that influences and helps and slowly move the business in that direction by influencing and creating this sort of expertise and subject matter expertise in the centre. The same with the stock. You know, we talked a lot about the infrastructure. We have to go around almost region by region and do this analysis, this infrastructure analysis that says, okay, we have this many warehouses. Germany, we have 82 sites and 110 warehouses. We don't need 110 warehouses. Well, how many warehouses do we need? So we'll go around each of the regions and create this digital baseline for them. And then we have to solve this whole issue of the pull-push process in paper and packaging. And probably the only way we've worked out to do that now is to have some sort of VMI or consignment stock that sits in the middle that allows one to push and one to pull and doesn't affect either. The last two we're starting to look at, and these will be later on in the process, are the value stream analysis, process mapping. So this is where I think the vast majority of our value sits. I think it sits in most companies. This is where the value is. Making sure your processes work. And then really, we're doing a lot of work on collaboration now. So a lot of work in looking at customers and suppliers, and in some cases, suppliers that are also competitors that we can collaborate with. So we're doing work, and you can't read this, I apologize. We're doing work in sort of CPFR, collaborative planning. We're doing work in joint RFQing. We're doing work at the delivery end of the chain to see if we can work with anybody like DHL to create a collection process for the packaging. So big amount of value in there, probably not available to us until year 2 or 3. Okay, so that 7 things we're doing within that sort of big structure of what we're trying to do in the next 3 years. I don't know how much time I've got left because we've got one more video. Let me just show you the second video. This is an interesting video about Asia, and then we'll finish. Thank you.
It's 2025, and China has become the greenest country on earth. Now it is demanding that we, in the dirty West, follow its example. As Europe and North America quickly adapt to the new Asian standards of sustainability, it's worth stepping back and considering how we got here. China's problems came to a head in 2017, when pollution rose to deadly levels in 3 megacities, Baoding, Qingdao, and Beijing. Protests erupted across social media and in the streets. The Chinese government reacted quickly with promises to take action. China's top-down governmental system made it possible for them to force change at any cost. They were looking for measurable results, so they launched the biggest data-gathering program the world has ever seen. It was a program that was enabled by cheap sensors and cloud-based computing. Every ton of CO2 that an individual or organization produced would be measured. There were to be no exceptions. And then they began to tax it. Mr. Xi brought in a European-style system of carbon caps and trading for companies and individuals across the country, affecting raw materials, packaging specifications, and energy consumption. Every transaction was logged, every exhaust on every truck, every plastic bag and cardboard box, even every nappy was taxed. The data scientists came to some surprising conclusions. They decided that recycling was less efficient in China than it was in Europe or America. Recycling needs infrastructure which is expensive, they said. Also, most of the materials the Chinese recycled were actually being shipped from the West. That trade had a high carbon footprint, but more importantly, it made China dependent on Europe and America for critical resources. The Chinese announced that they would recycle their own used packaging, but wouldn't buy our fiber anymore. Instead, they'd grow their own. Hundreds of millions of trees sprang up across Asia, genetically modified for fast growth. And while the trees were growing, China did deals with Nordic and South American countries to source forest fiber in return for manufactured goods. The Chinese government began subsidizing packaging systems in plastic, glass, and metals to allow manufacturers to reuse packages again and again, instead of relying only on single-use packaging. Other developing countries watched China closely and began to rethink their policies. How much was recycling actually saving them? Was it worth importing other countries' waste? Indonesia and Malaysia began replanting palm oil plantations with fast-growing trees. The price of recyclable fiber crashed. As Western companies reflected on the Chinese approach, they realized that they needed to change their approach to recycling if they wanted to compete and survive. This meant new targets, dramatic improvements in the way that materials were recovered and reused, and rules to make packaging part of a low-carbon recycling solution. A genuine circular economy based on packaging and recycling finally started to emerge. Manufacturers weren't the only polluters, of course. In India, the traffic was blocking the streets of Delhi and Mumbai, and exhaust fumes were damaging billions of lungs. So the Indian government decided on radical measures. All deliveries were to be performed at night using electric driverless delivery vehicles. These vehicles, once an exotic novelty, are now rolling out across the world, from Tokyo to Chicago. To achieve this, Delhi imposed strict size and shape regulations on packages to ensure the most efficient fit inside their trucks. This new Asian standard has been adopted across the world. Waste was also managed by fleets of unmanned vehicles that were able to monitor the sustainability of individual citizens. Those leading recklessly planet-damaging lives were publicly named and taxed heavily. 10 years ago, the most powerful computers in the world helped consumers to search, communicate, and shop. Today, computers 1,000 times more powerful monitor emissions around the globe. Big changes in packaging, logistics, and consumer behavior have improved the lives of billions in Asia and inspired a total rethink in the West about reuse and recycling. Given the choice between being watched or leaving a dangerous environmental legacy to our children, most of us have allowed governments to take a much greater part in our lives.
Okay. So that was done last year. Interestingly, some of the sort of, the Chinese stepping up to the agreements, the recycling agreements, and the Americans stepping back from them is quite an interesting concept. So anyway, that's sort of, there is another one that's you can get it if you're interested. You can go and search for it and get it on YouTube. But anyway, so just to close it down. So I've talked about DS Smith. I've talked about the fact that it's this very, very quick, for a packaging organisation, it's a very quick changing organisation. I've talked about the fact that that happens at such a speed that this has to start to happen at a speed, and the sort of processes and the initiatives and the tasks that we've got, the transformation tasks we've got back here that we're taking through now. And we've talked a little bit about the sort of some of the initiatives that we're going through. Nothing mind-blowing, nothing sort of spectacular, nothing that none of you are not already doing, but part of our sort of roadmap. So I guess really, remember we said reduce costs as a percentage of sales by 1% in 32 months. It's not 30 months. I tell my staff 30 months so they get a move on. And front-end loaded delivery. And really, that's what we're trying to aim for. Lower cost, be a highly adaptive network, be completely customer-centric, highly productive, innovation-driven network that really is driven by innovation. Data and analytics heavy, incredibly flexible, completely integrated, and very change-friendly. Okay? That's where we're trying to get to. And I guess to close it down, there's a couple of change. For me, this is all about change. The technical bits are the easy bits in most of our jobs. The technical bits, there's somebody that knows how to do that. The complicated bits are changing the culture and changing the mindset and changing the organisation to sort of bend to your will, effectively, if it ever does. And a great sort of quote from Winston Churchill, which was really about the Second World War and about danger, but you can adapt it for change. One ought never turn one's back on a threatened danger stroke change and try to run away from it. If you do that, you'll double the danger stroke change. But if you meet it promptly and without flinching, you'll reduce the danger stroke change by half. It's a very, very, very important quote. This is something you cannot sort of even walk away from for 4 weeks a lot of the time because it changes. So that's us. Thank you.